My name is David.
My name is Jason.
And this is Discern Realities, a Dungeon World podcast. Our first segment is What Happened Here Recently?
So, David, I have recently kicked off a brand new campaign, the follow-up campaign to We Hunt the Keepers, called Songs of the Shadow Court. And we just finished up the first series called Vaults of Shadow. Now, you might recall a couple of episodes ago, I was talking about how Fraser was not into his character idea. He was not loving the Ranger playbook. And we were trying to figure out what to do for him so that he could continue playing in the adventure with a character he liked. And I wanted to just update listeners on what we did there.
Yeah, how'd that end up going?
Yeah, so what he decided to do was make a character out of Class Warfare, which is Johnstone Metzger's very popular. Basically, it's a massive collection of compendium classes, essentially, but it has a procedure for creating your own custom playbook. He chose to use Class Warfare to build what is basically a ranger, but it's more in line with what he envisioned, which I think is really great. He chose a build that was ranger, but also with a compendium class sharpshooter and shadow. And that gave him a little bit more of the flavor he was looking for. It's more of a combination of like ranger and thief, as opposed to like a ranger who's out in the forest with a wolf animal companion, because it's always a wolf. Yeah. So I so liked the outcome on this that I actually made Class Warfare an option for the next series, which you're playing in, called Legend of Maine. So yeah, we haven't, I think we've covered Class Warfare briefly on this show before. I can't quite recall.
I think only briefly. I don't think we've ever dove real deep into it, but since you made it available and I was in your game, I was reading it all weekend, trying to figure it out again because I haven't looked at it in so long.
Well, so what'd you think of it?
I mean, it's good, but it has that like build your playbook thing, which is just like, I'm lazy and I don't want to have to like actually manipulate things. I just want to print off a play sheet and go. But it's like, it's all really cool stuff.
No, I hear that. I mean, I've always been an admirer of Class Warfare, but I wouldn't say I've been like a huge fan of Class Warfare. And I've never really incorporated it into my dungeon world. And I think that what you just said is part of the reason I have a sort of powered by the apocalypse purism that wants the playbooks to be like grab and go, you know, not have to like build something, not have to like cobble together pieces like some games do. Like Spirit of 77, for example, does this sort of like you cobble together a playbook, and I've never been in love with that. I like just the single playbook concept, the highly defined, you know, sort of genre emulation concept.
Yeah, it reminds me of like a trend in video games, like that I have seen where like used to you picked your character out and like the character had what it had, but then they got more and more like, oh, just build it from all these pieces. And that works great in a video game, but it's a lot harder in like a role-playing game where you actually have like physical components and text that you have to like actually somehow get on the same page, or else you've just got all kinds of paper around.
Well, to be fair, I mean, lots of role players do this all the time, right? They're called trad role players.
I know,
yeah.
And I'm not.
No, that's fair. I mean, so here's the reason why I'm coming around to Class Warfare. You know, in addition to what I just said, another sort of hesitation I always had about Class Warfare is that it seemed a little bland, almost. Not bland, but all the compendium classes, they weren't superficially specific. They were, I don't know if generic's the right word, but they were more like universal in nature. Whereas when I do compendium classes of my own, they're always really hyper specific, right? Like, you know, the spider thrall, you know, or a compendium class associated with a particular god or a particular enthusiasm or whatever, right? And so I always thought, oh, these are just a bit like generic-ish, and I don't know if this is really fun. But I have to say, I kind of like the space that it creates for people who are experienced with Dungeon World and maybe want a different kind of thing to build out something kind of new and exciting. And my sort of powered by the apocalypse purism has been falling away vis-a-vis Dungeon World lately, because I kind of feel like Dungeon World has sort of become its own thing in some ways. I think it's not super helpful to like compare Dungeon World to other PBTA games. It still has lots of PBTA in its DNA, which is really important to pay attention to, like we're going to in the third segment today. But I don't know, like there's a part of me that kind of loves the idea of building character classes, right? It's a trad impulse for sure. It's a sort of, it's definitely more of a kind of an old school way of doing things, but I think there's some space to do some really fresh, exciting things in there.
Yeah.
And I like some of the stuff that people are coming up with just already in Songs of the Shadow Court.
Yeah, we talked about it a bit last episode where I was saying I want to scratch that more traditional itch of being in combat in like a board game-esque way. And this like reading this over the weekend, reading Class Warfare over the weekend, it was kind of doing the same thing where it's like, man, I could build really interesting and cool characters. I could min-max the hell out of like these moves. And maybe, you know, some of them are more story-edited min-maxing, but some of them would be more like number crunching min-maxing. But yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess if I had a Class Warfare like software program that I could make single sheets of paper, like I would pay money for that.
That's fair. I mean, I get the argument of like, I totally get the argument of like, you know, I like to just grab it and go and not have to spend too much time on it. And that's a great reason to like stick to, you know, like indie and story games, right? Because they don't have that huge amount of like overhead and input before you begin play, right? But I think it's, I'm excited by the possibilities in Class Warfare. I've run so much Dungeon World at this point, and I'm playing with people who have played Dungeon World with me a lot that I'm ready to kind of give people new experiences, you know?
Yeah, I definitely understand that. All right, well, so how else is your campaign progressing?
Yeah, I got more notes here. So, it's going really well. I'm doing a somewhat unusual thing where, so backstory on Songs of the Shadow Court. The Shadow Court is this large sort of global conspiracy kind of organization, I guess, they sort of day to day, they take jobs like kind of infiltrating things and stealing things and committing assassinations and whatnot, in order to pay the bills. But they have there's this like deeper backstory with the Shadow Court where basically they are the tool of a spider goddess called Malgoliant, and they go on these special missions in order to subtly affect world events, which are all part of like a grand ritual to bring Malgoliant back into the world. She can't enter the world at present. And part of that is they have this magical technique called a shadow vault. And that was the reference to the name of the last series, Vaults of Shadow, where basically these very important moments in history, or even just like small moments in history that have a sort of like, you know, cascading effect, you know, based off like what happened, they're kind of like frozen in a sort of time loop where there's a member of the Shadow Court kind of stuck in the vault trying to change a particular outcome, and they can't change it, right? They are constantly defeated. They can't change whatever the thing is that needs to get changed. So for example, the kickoff thing in Vaults of Shadow was there was this young exiled prince who received this tarot card reading that told him that his uncle had betrayed him. And this kicks off a big war that has implications for the future. And the Shadow Court is trying to stop this tarot reading from happening, but the Shadow Court operative can't do it. And so he's kind of stuck. And so he uses this magical technique to sort of basically freeze this moment in time to give the Shadow Court another chance, more chances to try to stop this tarot card reading. And so the party goes into the Shadow Vault, which is just a metaphor for this sort of like magical technique. They go into the Shadow Vault to try to change that event, and therefore it affects the present timeline of the scenario. And so what ends up happening is after they're done with that mission, the player characters come back into a world that is quite changed, right? And it's largely the same, because this historical event might not be the kind of thing that would change, you know, the history of the whole world, but it's different in subtle ways. And so when they come back from the Shadow Vault mission, we spend a lot of time painting the scene, talking about the ways that the city they're from is slightly different, you know, based off what they just did. And I have this concept, this custom move called the Anchor Fire. And what it is members of the Shadow Court who do Shadow Vault work have to find a quote fire in the city, which is just any location that has a lantern or a bonfire or something. And this is the fire that they sit at to sort of be present in the world, to anchor themselves into the world, and to sort of come to terms with their new reality, right? And there's a whole custom move associated with it where basically the shadows that are created by the fire will kind of whisper to them, where they can sort of gain some advantages in a sort of like meditative way as they spend time contemplating the fire. So it's got a real particular kind of flavor. I'm really loving it. The first series went off great, and I'm excited to see where the second one goes.
Yeah, that's a really good concept that you have there for how shadow vaults affect the world. It's a very sci-fi concept, very fantasy
it's
sci-fi.
It's super sci-fi. Yeah. In fact, Fraser Simons was in that series, and he's a big cyberpunk guy, right? He wrote the Veil RPG, and he also has one kickstarting right now called Hack the Planet, in fact. And he told me, he's like, this is a cyberpunk as fuck fantasy. Right. And it really is. It does have a sort of sci-fi feel. It's kind of like it's aesthetically, it's all very fantasy, but yeah, it definitely has like sci-fi notions of like time manipulation and, and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. I was reading a book recently that was a similar concept, but that's really good. But it sounds like there's not this regular notion of like your predetermined whatever outcome like so often happens. They are actually, it sounds like, able to change things. More like
like when the group gets sent into the Shadow Vault, they're getting sent in because the operative currently in the vault, who quote unquote created the vault, in order to capture this moment in time to create this loop so that it will always happen. Like they are there to like do the job that person can't do, right? And what's really interesting about the whole Shadow Vault concept is it's a really powerful magic that sort of like freezes this moment into a sort of perpetual loop, right? And the funny thing is, the way it plays out is the Shadow Vault is the means by which they get another chance at changing history, but the Shadow Vault also is constantly pushing back against them, right? And so while they're on the mission, as things are going pear-shaped, the Shadow Vault is like opening up rips in time and space to like move the pieces around, to move the characters around, to change things, right? So it's almost got like a danger room kind of feel to it.
It's like
right?
Stephen King's 11/22/63.
It's very much like that. Yeah. And so that was another cool aspect of it, the way the Shadow Vaults sort of like fight back against the Shadow Court.
Well, that's awesome. I can't wait to hear more about that in future episodes.
Indeed. But that's all I got.
Is that one that you expect will one day be released onto its own kind of podcast?
Yeah, it might follow up We Hunt the Keepers. We'll see how We Hunt the Keepers goes, I guess. But yeah.
Cool. Well, let's move on to our next segment. Our next segment is What Should I Be on the Lookout For?
So, listeners, you may recall that we had a podcast at one time called Comic Strip AP, which was a sort of expanded version of the AP that we do here on this show, right? And we are no longer actively producing Comic Strip AP. We've got a few more that we want to finish up, but we're not doing new Comic Strip APs. And indeed, we are sunsetting that podcast. There's lots of different reasons for it, which we may go into someday. Largely, I think the concept was just a little too ahead of its time. That's my opinion. I think like people just weren't quite ready for this really wild, frankly, radical concept in actual play. And so we may revisit it in the future, but for now it's going on hiatus. But what I want to tell you about is one of the very most popular ones that we did, the Alford Soultaker Dungeon World series done by Ollie Jeffrey and Rob Bullen. That is concluded now. They completed the last 2 episodes, which are going to be in the feed by the time this episode comes out. They're not up now, and I have not myself heard them yet, but it is finished. I know a lot of people have been asking for it. It was handily the most popular of all the comic strip APs that we had out there. I mean, there were a bunch of really good ones, but the Alfred Soultaker stuff was really, really good. It was like, I mean, they were giving you production values. Right?
Yeah, it was, oh man, so. It was so good. Definitely. If you haven't listened to it and you have any interest at all in like some good, just like storytelling that's happening through Dungeon World, that's a great way to hear some. And they were running the, what's the special one-on-one?
The Legacy Weapon.
Yeah. And they were running the Legacy Weapon through that. So if you want to know kind of how that goes.
Yeah. By Phil Vecchione, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I have not listened to the final 2 episodes myself, and I actually haven't listened to the series in quite a while because it's been a while since they recorded a new one. But I got in touch with Michael Barford, who's one of the producers on Comic Strip AP, and he kind of gave me a rundown of like why you all need to listen to this when it comes out. he says that the Alford Soultaker AP is particularly good for the way it breaks down Dungeon World moves. Essentially, every time they do a brand new move, they kind of like break it down a little bit, like right there on the show. So it is still actual play. It's not like, it's not like a radio drama, right?
Right.
Second thing, he recommends the show because of the voice work. Apparently the characterizations, and as I recall, the ones that I listened to, the characterizations and personalities were really sharp and really good. I think they get it by.
I think they're cheating.
Just because, they're cheating because they have British accents, but whatever. That's just my dig. But they also did a really good job with their characterizations. And he also mentions that it has this segment that kind of starts The War Is, where it kind of goes into some of the backstory and stuff. And he likes that because it presents the backstory of the setting and of the Alfred character without kind of getting in the way. And all of it just kind of comes together to be a really, really remarkable piece of entertainment and Dungeon World, fun. And so we'll have some links to that stuff in the show notes.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. I can't wait to hear those last two. I was a big fan of the series. Let's move on to our next segment. Our next segment is What Here Is Not What It Appears to Be. Jason, this week I thought we would talk about the concept of hard moves and how we handle them, because like we talked about a little bit earlier in the podcast, PBTA games are a bit different than Dungeon World in a lot of ways. And as I've played more and more PBTA games beyond Dungeon World, I've noticed a trend where players will lean more heavily into getting their characters into trouble without the GM or the DM or the MC or whatever you want to call it, whatever your PBTA games happens to be, without them driving for it. The players will do it themselves. What do you think about that?
I think that's right. I do think, in my experience, the average Dungeon World player, or the Dungeon World player I most encounter, is not as inclined to embrace failure and to run forward towards adversity and complications like the players in other Powered by the Apocalypse games. And I think there's some really good reasons for that, right?
I think so.
For one thing, Dungeon World has more long-term character investment, right? The characters level much further than a normal PBTA game character does. There are more choices to be made, right? There are more branches you can take to sort of like pad out your character. In a normal PBTA game, you might have a selection of like 5 moves or something, right? Like it's not some huge amount, and you might only have them for, 4 or 5 advancements. But in Dungeon World, there are dozens of moves on the playbooks, and you are going to have like 10 levels of advancement potentially. And so I think because there's just a little bit more character investment, is a little bit more trad in that way, I think that's part of the reason why players aren't as inclined to rush forward toward danger, right?
Yeah.
Another thing is kind of dovetailing with what I just said. I think Dungeon World playbooks, even though like other PBTA games, you just grab the playbook and go, they are a little bit more personalized than in other PBTA games. In other PBTA games, you basically just have to choose stats and look and stuff, right? But in Dungeon World, you choose things like your species, like your alignment. Like I said earlier, you have a lot more like move selections, especially starting at level 2. Obviously at level 2s when you start doing that. You can multi-class. You can do compendium classes. You might be doing class warfare like we just talked about. So I think that like investment and that personalization is part of the reason why a lot of DW players, they just approach it more. They approach danger and complication more like a traditional role-playing game. And that's actually pretty fair because Dungeon World emulates D&D, right? And that's the way D&D is. And also, if your Dungeon World game is like more sort of like OSR flavored, it makes sense that your characters want to avoid danger because that's a strong principle of the OSR, right? Like avoiding danger. But I think another major reason, and what we're going to talk about a little bit here today, is sometimes GMs don't do a great job of making their hard moves and the associated dangers fit nicely with the concept of being a fan of the characters, right? It's more punitive than celebratory.
Yeah, I can see that. It's definitely, if you're coming from a more traditional background, like that was kind of the way that it happened, is you were supposed to be more adversarial as opposed to collectively telling a story.
I think that's right.
Yeah, and I mean, that still comes through in a lot of ways, like you've mentioned, like, and then in a few other ways, like the fact that you have armor, the fact that you have hit points, like, and not just like a wheel that has a few timers on it that like are your health and things like that.
Yeah, there are tons of signifiers on the sheets that this is a more traditional GM as adversary sort of role, right? And also, like, honestly, there's just a sort of general notion that, or I don't know, I perceive this to be like something that people think that Dungeon World is about like adventure and heroism and looking cool, right? And rushing forward towards danger or embracing failure is kind of the opposite of looking cool if it's done wrong, right? All that stuff kind of comes together, I think, to basically throw the ball back into the GM's court to say, hey, you know, if you want to have a game that's a little bit more like a normal Powered by the Apocalypse game, if you want to have an experience where the players get excited about the complications in their characters' lives, you know, first things first, go to your principles, you know, be a fan of the characters, right? But I think there's some other things you can do too. Yeah.
All right. So you mentioned that you think that this might be an issue of the GM of the GM being too punitive and not being fan of the characters and how they are facilitating these hard moves. Unpack that a bit. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'll make reference quickly to a recent episode of the Gauntlet podcast where Kate Bullock and I talked about what it means to be a fan of the characters. Like, how can you do hard moves and still be a fan of the characters, right? That was one of the questions we had on the GM Masterclass episode that we just did. And so I'm picking up a lot of this, what I'm about to say from that episode. And I definitely recommend people go listen to it because it had a lot of like universally applicable ideas in it. But to me, being a fan of the characters doesn't necessarily mean letting them succeed or always giving them opportunities to succeed. Being a fan of the characters can mean seeing how they deal with adversity, right? Which is kind of what we're saying here. Essentially, the question is, how can I make my Dungeon World players lean into and love danger? How can I get them to embrace failure as an exciting aspect of the storytelling? And the first way you do that is, I think, pay attention to the goal posting, okay? And when I say goal posting, I mean a really specific thing here. Players will tell you in lots of different ways what kind of experience they want to have with their character, even if they're just doing it subconsciously, right? Your goal as a GM is to identify those things and then make the complications in their lives tie back to those things, right? So the playbook they choose, the choices they make on their playbook, that tells you a lot, right? If your player, for example, makes a halfling character in a party full of human-sized people, in a setting full of human-sized people where it would be really kind of difficult to be a halfling, they're kind of telling you something, right? They're telling you that they want to explore the complications of the halfling's size, right? And that's a GM move in Dungeon World, right? Show them the downside of their, I think it's called, they say race, but I prefer species, but, you know, show them the downside of their character choices, right? You know, if you choose to be an evil character in a party of good characters, I don't think that's the player just being contrary. I think that's the player saying something about, I want this to be a complicating factor in my life. And so, you know, the goal posting is super important. The move selection goal posting doesn't really come in until, like, say, level 2, when the players actually get to make some choices with their moves. But for example, if someone's playing a fighter and they choose the heirloom move, okay, you get the heirloom move. They've got the, you know, the spirit and all that stuff. And mechanically, it's a pretty cool move. It has a really nice benefit. But I think what the player's really telling you is, I want the spirits of my ancestors to be a big part of the story. And you can translate that to be, I want the complications to come from this. Like, I'm excited about that. So I think whenever you're paying attention to those player choices, those goal posting things, and you then, you know, not all the time, but at least some of the time, make your hard moves tie into those things, I think the players naturally love it. And you begin to create this culture at the table of embracing danger, embracing failure, embracing complication.
Yeah, I agree 100% that if you can tie it back to very, very character specific things, or things that it seems like that they want as players, but maybe that, like, their character might not want it, like, that is going to drive your story in a better way that is going to make them more likely to put themselves at risk. Maybe not suggesting exactly what will happen to them if it goes poorly, but at least they're anticipating it, and maybe a small part of them is hoping for it a little bit.
You know, I'm going to use an example here of one of the players that I play with somewhat regularly. Her name's Maria. And at last campaign during We Hunt the Keepers, she chose a character who had a sort of starlight motif, right? That was it was a fighter. She had kind of this starlight motif going on. And I kind of picked up on that a little bit by making a quest item in the adventure be this item called the First Starlight, right? And the First Starlight was guarded by this terrible monster called a star beast or something like that. It was something like that. It was some kind of zodiac based star monster. I can't remember exactly what it was. And it was defending the First Starlight. And yet after they defeated it and got the First Starlight, she was determined to make the First Starlight like part of her character, like part of her sword. Right. And I asked her at the time, out of character, I said, you know, if you do this, that's going to be a problem because these star beasts, there are 11 other ones. These star beasts are trying to protect the First Starlight. They're trying to always, they always want to have control of the First Starlight. Are you willing to like invite that down on your character's head? And she was like, yes, like, yes, 100%. I want that. Right. It was a great illustration of kind of what we're talking about here. And so in the future, like whenever she would have a hard move, whenever she would get the sword with the first Starlight infused sword involved with things, it would go pear-shaped. And I would have a star beast like intervene, or I would hint at a star beast. She loved it, right? Even I'm pretty sure one of those star beasts killed her characters in the end, or got pretty close to it, or definitely grievously injured her once. She still loved it, right? Because the hard moves I was making tied into what she had signaled to me she wanted to explore in her character. Right?
Yeah, that's such a classic fantasy thing too, is though the character did not know it, they incorporated something about the magical world into whatever they're doing, and it is constantly bringing danger to them, but it's worth the risk. And we, as the audience or as players, are aware of it, even though the character may not be, and it's part of the joy of fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and Maria's doing it again too in Legerdemain, right, where her character definitely standing out from the rest, right? Her character walks around in clothes stained with blood, right? Like she looks like a gory horror show all the time, right? And I'm still trying to figure out how to lean into that and give her the experience that she wants with that character. But I know what she's doing, right? She's saying, yeah, this is definitely like a complicating factor in my character's life. And she's already in that culture, obviously, of like wanting to embrace complication. My job is to give her that, right? Is to make the fact that she walks around in bloody clothes a big problem.
Right. So it sounds like you are down for the players being more in this PBTA mindset of inviting danger down on their own heads.
Right. Well, and what we're saying here is like, in order to encourage them to embrace that culture, they have to trust that you're going to always give them that, right? Like that you're going to make sure your hard moves tie into it. Absolutely. You know, one other thing, you know, just to kind of bring it back to hard moves, I know you have some thoughts on this. Another way that you can kind of get this culture going at your table is to invite the table to participate in your hard moves, right?
Yeah, definitely. Like, that's not a bad thing, especially if you kind of give it like a soft border around, this is kind of what I'm thinking. What do you guys think? And then let them flesh it out a little bit or add on to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, honestly, sometimes just for pure practical reasons, because I can't think of anything, I sometimes turn to the table and I say, okay, I've got a 6- on the table. What do you think we should do? Or what do you guys think we should do? Or sometimes if the player was really pushing their luck in terms of their character's actions, right? Like they were really, really pushing their luck. I will sometimes like say, oh man, we really need to fuck this guy up. Like, what do you guys think? Right. And the players almost always come up with something even more devilish and dangerous than what you could come up with, right? But they love it, right? They love it and they get excited about it. And again, it just goes back to sort of like creating this really particular play culture, this really particular feel at the table, right? That I think ultimately what we're getting at is it leads to good story, right? I don't think it's super interesting if the characters are always successful and always heroic.
Right. Yeah. That's not good storytelling if they're always doing the best and it's never going poorly for them or anything.
Or always
like
avoiding
that.
Danger, right?
Yeah. Or they're always dodging it. They're always tripping it with a 10-foot pole or whatever.
Anything else you want to say about this? Or
yeah, I have strong feelings almost to the opposite. Like, I like it in other PBTA games when the players are coming up with complications for themselves and complicating factors. And I don't mind in Dungeon World when my players like will do something that seems risky but has a reward. But I don't always like when my Dungeon World players just invite danger down upon themselves for like no good reason.
Well, I think I kind of see what you're saying there, because I think what you've done is kind of, whether you meant to or not, what you've identified here is a sort of weird tension with Dungeon World versus other PBTA games, which is in Dungeon World, it's a little bit more GM driven, right? Right. It's a little bit more GM driven. You are supposed to prepare a dungeon, draw a map and leave spaces, right? You're supposed to have fronts, it's supposed to be just a little bit more GM driven. And I think the tension that I think that's bugging you there is when players like really, really lean into like, I just want to have my life totally complicated because I think that's cool. You might have an issue where their actions are conflicting with the adventure, right? Right.
So here's the thing. And this is true of some PBTA games, but not all, but it is definitely true of Dungeon World. In Dungeon World, you are a part of a party, and the party needs you to be competent and like not just a burden. So you can have like complicating factors, but if you are just dragging the party down, I feel bad for the party. And like, if I'm a player and I'm not the GM, I'm kind of like getting perturbed that like, hey, you're like always making life harder. Like,
yeah. That's another one of those tensions too, right? In other PBTA games, it's not party based necessarily. Well, like the Sprawl, it is, right? But most of them, it's not. Characters just sort of wandering about their day, right? And so, yeah, that's definitely like another tension there for sure.
Right. So I think that in Dungeon World, you have to be mindful of that. If you want to do this, that like the party is also kind of counting on you. And if the party is all down for it, like I bet that everyone that was in Maria's group was real excited to see her get that first Starlight.
They were, yeah, because everyone kind of knew, oh man, we're going to get big bad Star Beast monsters now, right?
Right.
And they love that,
that's
right?
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a difference between just being like, like embracing danger and complication because you think it's going to lead to good story and doing it just because you're a nihilist, right? I think what your job there as a GM, what I would do, and I have had to do this sometimes when I feel like a player is just being like really contrary to the party's aims, really like just kind of being a bit of a roadblock or just kind of getting in the way with their role play a little bit, I'll interrogate it, right? Like I'll interrogate it. I'll try to ask questions like, well, what is it about this making you want to do this? Like, why is your character going over here? What do you hope to gain by doing that? Like, what is your character's motivation? I'll start to interrogate that a little bit to see if they can come up with some answers. And if it seems like they're not really sure, I might just say like, well, what is it about this moment that's so exciting to you? Like, and then I'll try to like figure out if I can just take whatever it is that's exciting about their behavior right now and maybe recontextualize it a little bit to make it something that kind of moves a little bit closer to what the party is doing, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty advanced GMery, but it's a thing, you can do. I'm reminded of Garrett's character Archon in We Hunt the Keepers, right? First session, I was having a really hard time with Archon because he was playing his character in a way that was so almost antagonistic, right? And I had a difficult time with it, and I had to really kind of interrogate that a little bit, like post-session and in debrief and kind of privately with Garrett to figure out like what his character concept was and like why he felt like doing these strange invasive actions and sort of contrary actions in the party, like what it was bringing to the story. And eventually we got there, right? But it definitely required a certain like touch.
Yeah. So yeah, I think I would just end all this in saying like, this may be a bit of an advanced tactic to really get the most out of your Dungeon World experience. And a lot of it is predicated on trust. So you need that trust at the table. You need the trust to know like, hey, I can trust the GM to make the game more interesting, to be a fan of the characters if I act dangerous in this way. We also have the trust that like, hey, the GM is going to be dangerous in the ways that are most interesting to play, so I can do that. So, yeah.
System matters, but play culture matters more.
I agree, 100%. Awesome. Any final thoughts?
Nope, I'm good.
Let's move on to our next segment. Our next segment is What Here is Useful or Valuable to Me?
Listeners, we are still going through contest entries. We will have made our selections very soon, but we have not done so as of the date of this recording. In the meantime, though, we are going to read another entry. David, what entry are we reading today?
So we're going to be reading The Keeper of the Omegatherion of Fasar by James Hardy. Did I get that keeper name right?
I don't know, but we'll roll with it.
All right. So this is by James Hardy, and here's the text. Fasar was a taxidermist, turning the hunts of the wealthy into impressive trophies to serve as proof of exaggerated skill. He gained success when he began crafting strange homunculi, impressive and sometimes horrifying creatures that never were, for nobles to impress the gullible. But he learned the difference between wealth and status when his son died at a noble's party, and none of his patrons would use their influence to help him get justice. Fasar fought, but after wasting all his money on his quest for justice, he succumbed to dark vengeance and constructed a hideous construct, a pastiche of different monsters in the vague form of a man, which gained life from its creator's boundless rage. Now it stalks the nights, killing nobles and harvesting their pieces for unknown purposes.
And here are the stats for the Omegatherion. It's solitary, intelligent, terrifying, and a construct. Its weapons are scalpel claws. They do d10 plus 2 damage, plus 1 piercing, and close. It has 19 hit points and 2 armor. Instinct, to soak its stuffing with the blood of the rich. Special qualities. The Omegatherion does not heal normally, but can replace damaged parts with time and privacy. It can also change its body, attaching exotic creature parts to itself in any fashion it wants. When encountered, it should have 1 or 2 additional special moves based on its current pieces. It's fond of giant wings, but they wear out and aren't easy to replace, so mostly it's encountered grounded. Its moves are appear or disappear into the shadows, and sever tendons. So why'd you pick it?
I think it's just a really cool Frankenstein-esque monster, but it's like way more interesting than a Frankenstein monster should be, because it's about this taxidermist, and he's given the thing scalpel hands, so it can just go removing other parts of things and putting them on, and that's gonna like, I feel like that's going to be a lot of fun for a GM to play around with, like,
and it murders rich people.
Yeah.
Right. It strikes a blow against the oligarchy as well as being an awesome abomination monster. So.
Yeah, I just imagine the players continually like stumbling upon like dissected creatures, and they're like, oh crap, it's incorporated X, Y, or Z into itself now, and we're gonna have to deal with that.
Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah, I like that little. Yeah, that's a good soft move there to lead up to the hard move, right?
Oh yeah, I think this is a fun monster for sure that I could see an entire like adventure being centered around.
Yeah, you could have a really, really good like kind of murder mystery with it, right?
Yeah, almost like a merger between Dungeon World and Monster of the Week.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Any last thoughts?
No, it's pretty cool. I like it.
Let's move on to our next segment.
Hello. I have 2 very important things to share with you. The first, after a long wait, Codex back issues are now available on DriveThru RPG, so if you joined our Patreon late, and missed some of the earlier issues, you can now round out your collection. The second, the newest issue of Codex, Codex Cold, is available in our Patreon feed through March 2018. Here's what you'll find inside. Firelight, an original powered by the Apocalypse game and Game Chef 2017 finalist. The Wreck of the Void Hatred, a chilling OSR scenario. Balia, which I may not be pronouncing correctly, but is in any case a rural town in Ireland for Monster Hearts 2. Our newest Gauntlet daddy, Cold Cock. 5 dozen unusual things about the body we just found, a number of original illustrations, and a custom layout by Ollie Jeffrey. To get Codex Cold, just make a $4 or higher pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon by March 31st. That's at patreon.com/Gauntlet. And do check DriveThruRPG for the Codex back issues. Thank you.
Our next segment is What is About to Happen. This is the ongoing adventure of St. Evelyn the White, also known as the Mad Saint. She has most recently entered the Beaten Barley, where a strange and disturbing minstrel was playing his half-harp. His name was Zagan, and he was delighted with the apparent death of the owner of the Beaten Barley's husband's death. The owner, Marlene, has just come back in, and she seems distraught as she confides in St. Evelyn that her husband, Ned, has died, and it was unclear whether or not she had seen his body for herself. But Zagan nevertheless seemed delighted. St. Evelyn was trying to persuade Marlene to hand over a weapon and get out so St. Evelyn could do something. St. Evelyn, did you have something you wanted to say?
You forgot to mention he has hooves.
Yes, out of the corner of her eye, St. Evelyn noticed this Zagan character appeared to have little hooved feet, but when she stares directly at his legs, they just seem to be mundane boots. St. Evelyn, let's get a charisma roll to see if you can convince Marlene, unless you have some other move.
No, I'm happy to just try to convince her. I've already done sufficient fiction, I guess, from last time.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that's a 6.
That's good. She takes a metal rod out from underneath the bar, and she puts it down on the table subtly, and she looks you in the eye. She says, "Are you sure?"
Yes, completely.
And she goes into the back. Now, Jason, let's have a conversation here. You think that Zagan is a demon, don't you?
I do think he's a demon, yeah.
St. Evelyn is convinced that Zagan is a demon. In fact, he is not.
Ah, so this is out of character knowledge, huh?
Yeah. So, what would St. Evelyn think would be the most effective way to attack a demon?
I think I would need like a bladed silver weapon. But honestly, I think it might be the sort of demon that will just run away if I give it enough cause.
Okay.
Just more of a trickster than anything else, right?
Sure. Which may not be far from the truth, but nevertheless, just he's not a demon, but St. Evelyn is convinced he is.
I'm convinced he is, yep, and I'm pressing forward with this.
All right,
thought.
St. Evelyn, what do you do?
So there's a rod on the table?
Yep.
Or on the counter? Like a...
It's just a piece of pig iron.
Okay, like a boat, like a crowbar, something to hit him with, basically, right?
Pretty much. But it's not silver.
Well, that's fair. I grab it and I turn and brandish it at Zagan.
And the music stops. And his eyes go a solid blue. Blue like the deep ocean.
Foul creature from hell, state your purpose for being here, or I will smite you.
You know nothing of my kind, saint. What are you going to do? Try and exorcise me?
I am going to take approximately 15 paces forward and unleash my fury upon your head.
I will best you if this comes to combat, you small, small woman.
Explain yourself now. You say you are no demon. You claim to be something else. What are you?
He doesn't seem particularly interested in accommodating your requests right now. In fact, he seems to be approaching you. He seems very upset that you have challenged him in this way.
I also I take the first of my 15 paces as well. Less than 15 now that he's helping close the gap as well, right? You hurry to your demise, creature.
And he, all of a sudden, is just right in front of you. And he just gives you a wallop. Just hits your body with his hand. And your body gets lifted off the ground and thrown several paces.
Nice. Did I take any damage, or am I just like stunned or something?
Yeah, you're probably stunned right now. Yeah.
Okay, I'll mark that. I am on the ground. I assume the rod went clanging to the ground as well.
Yeah, it's still near enough by.
Is Marlene still around, or did she go to the back?
She went to the back.
And it's just me and Zagan.
That's right.
What sort of trickery was that? Demonic trickery, no doubt, I say, as I try to I sort of woozily lift myself up to my feet. I think I see the floor kind of bisecting and spinning in front of me, right? Like a kaleidoscope.
Yeah. And what do you know about demons, St. Evelyn?
Yeah, I think this might be a good call. I may ask about lore about it.
Yeah.
I know something interesting about demons. It was a 7.
You know something interesting. I'm just going to give this to you. You know demons can't do the things that just happened.
Throw me across the room?
They can't approach the holy as this thing has just approached you and tossed you when you're in your holy vestments, which I assume your white robes are.
A simple observation that I should have been aware of, and I would have been aware of if I wasn't shaky right now, but yes.
So what do you do with that knowledge?
Very well, creature. You are no demon, for if you were, you would not have been able to approach me in that manner. So what are you? Why are you here?
I am here for Marlene. She was always one to put out first milk and fresh bread until that pesky husband of her came along.
So you've come to continue receiving your offerings of milk and bread. Were you responsible for injuring her husband? Killing her husband?
Oh, if only I had the pleasure, but no. He went away. I don't know where he went. But no, I am no longer here for first of anything, as the rituals have stopped. I have come for Marlene herself. The full moon has brought me, and the new moon will take me away, and her with me. And you are just a stumbling block in my path.
She is subject to some sort of dark pact, then?
Dark pacts. You have such a small mind. And he's walking towards you again.
I lurch forward. I say, I will make no statement about the size of my mind, but I will say this. My dedication to the gods is vast.
Oh, the gods. The gods have no say on my kind. And it looks like he's getting ready to try and force you out of the beaten barley.
This whole time while I am kind of stumbling toward him, we're having this little speech back and forth, I am looking around the room, trying to see if there's anything that I can use to help seize an advantage here, anything about the creature's movements that I hadn't immediately observed that might be helpful.
Discern realities.
I got a 7, so I get one question.
Okay.
What here is useful or valuable to me?
You notice that he seemed most interested in disarming you of that pig iron. He keeps moving away from it, like he doesn't want anything to do with it. But you know already that directly confronting him is not going to be successful. So what you notice that is most valuable is directly above him in his path is an iron chandelier.
With this knowledge, I think I would try to observe if he is particularly vulnerable to the iron in some way, or if he can't come in contact with it or be near it. I see the chandelier and I'm wondering, if I brought this chandelier down on top of him, would that affect him in a certain way? Or can he just not break is he scared to be underneath the chandelier because of some sort of magical, ensorcelment or something? I don't know. But I think with that knowledge, I think I'm just trying to deepen my understanding of the situation here and find out what I can learn.
So you're trying to spout lore again?
I think I'm trying to DR again.
Trying to DR a second time.
Yeah.
All right. This is your last shot, though. He's directly underneath that chandelier. If you can't figure out something here, he's probably kicking you out.
I got a 10 this time.
You got 3 questions. Think fast, Saint
First
Evelyn.
of all, what here is not what it appears to be.
This creature has given you some subtle hints that it is not a demon and is in fact of the Fey realm. It's a fairy.
Apart from the chandelier, maybe connected to something, maybe with an eye for something that might help me get the chandelier down. What here is useful or valuable to me?
It's tied to a peg right nearby that would normally be used to lower it to light the candles.
Fantastic. And third question, mostly in terms of the creature's intentions. What is about to happen?
It's about to just throw you out of the beaten barley, keep you out so that it can do whatever it's trying to do.
I have a small hand axe that I use for camping, to chop wood and things like that.
Yeah.
I want to grab it, quickly spin around, and cut that rope to drop the chandelier down on top of him.
Defy danger dexterity.
With +1, right?
With +1 for following up, yeah.
12.
Awesome. The chandelier comes crashing down on it, and you'll see that iron burns its skin. I'll let you describe the scene.
Yeah, so I think, just backing up a little bit, I think he's getting closer and closer, and I even step forward to try to stop him so that he's directly under the chandelier, right? And I kind of just stare him dead in the eyes, and he's getting ready to raise his hand and do whatever magic he's going to do at me. And I just spin, I just quickly spin 2 or 3 spins to the left to where that rope is. And I just hack that rope really quickly, send it falling down, crashes on top of him. And he's just screaming out as the iron burns him. And it smells kind of like bacon.
And we will end it there as he screams out and Marlene comes in from the back room. That just leaves one final question. Who's really in control here?
Discern Realities is a production of the Gauntlet. We can be found on our website, gauntlet-rpg.com. We have a G Plus community. Just go to the community section of G Plus and search for the Gauntlet. We're on Twitter, fabulous Twitter account, @GauntletRPG. Go follow us. We have contests going on right now. If you follow us on Twitter by sometime in March, you are entered into drawings to win a copy of Kira McGrann's A Cozy Den, which is Lesbian Snake powered by the Apocalypse game. And what else do we have to talk about? We're on Patreon, patreon.com/Gauntlet.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, listeners. That's our show.